A single copper wire hums with a lethal blue-white vibration. A discarded iron nail glows red-hot, then melts into a puddle of slag. Eirik Vinter stares at the empty air, his hands trembling with phantom static. The silence of the room shatters as the light travels faster than any living bird. The Aether-Guild's monopoly on truth just died in a basement. Eirik wiped the sweat from his forehead with a soot-stained sleeve. He stared at the primitive circuit board nailed to his workbench. The copper coils pulsed with a faint, rhythmic heat. Beside the bench, the merchant Vane clutched a heavy velvet purse. Vane's eyes tracked the glowing wire as if it were a coiled viper. The merchant reached out, then pulled his hand back as a spark snapped against the wood. Eirik watched the man's face pale in the flickering candlelight. He knew the cost of this display was written in the deep gray lines around his own eyes. His vitality was the fuel for a machine that the laws of this world rejected. Eirik pointed to the far corner of the basement. A small bulb, rigged with scavenged filaments, flared into life. It was a clean, steady illumination that defied the smoky gloom of Oakhaven. Vane gasped, dropping his purse onto the damp stone floor. Gold coins spilled out, rolling into the shadows near the foundation. "The guild would kill for this," Vane whispered, his voice cracking. Eirik did not look at the merchant. He watched his own fingers, which were turning a sickly, translucent shade of white. The drain on his life force was immediate and visceral. He felt his pulse stutter, a cold weight settling into his marrow. He ignored the pain and turned back to the copper spool. The city above them was a sprawling maze of rain-drenched iron and stone. Every message sent to the southern front lines passed through the guild's agonizing soul-binding process. Birds died in agony to carry words across the empire. Eirik's wire offered a faster, crueler path to the truth. Vane stepped toward the workbench, his greed finally overcoming his terror. He reached for the glowing coil, his fingers greedy and unwashed. Eirik slammed his hand down, pinning the merchant's wrist to the table. The air smelled of ozone and damp rot. They were not alone in the city. Eirik felt the hum of the guild's surveillance in the periphery of his mind. Magister Hrolf Grendel had eyes in every gutter and ears in every wall. The unexplained surge of power had already sent a ripple through the city's copper reserves. Eirik shoved the merchant toward the cellar stairs. He needed to move before the guild's seekers detected the residual charge in the walls. He looked at his workbench one last time. The tools he had spent years crafting were now liabilities. He grabbed a heavy leather satchel and stuffed his notes inside. He climbed the stairs, his legs feeling like leaden weights. The rain hammered against the roof of the tenement, masking the sound of his heavy breathing. He stepped out into the narrow alleyway. The cobblestones were slick with oil and refuse. He kept his head down, blending into the flow of laborers returning from the foundry. The city of Oakhaven loomed over him, its chimneys belching thick black smoke into the night sky. He felt the familiar ache of his stolen years. Each spark he generated carved another day from his lifespan. He was a man dying for a revolution that hadn't even begun. He reached his workshop, a cramped space hidden behind a tannery. The door stood slightly ajar. A cold draft pulled the scent of stale chemicals into the street. He drew a small rusted knife from his belt. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pushed the door open with the toe of his boot. The interior was a wreckage of splintered wood and torn parchment. His precious copper coils had been ripped from the walls, leaving jagged scars in the plaster. Everything he had built was systematically dismantled. He moved to the center of the room, his boots crunching on broken glass. On his main work table, a piece of parchment was pinned down by a heavy steel spike. He leaned closer. A dark, viscous fluid pooled around the base of the metal. It was blood. He pulled the spike free, the parchment tearing as he lifted it. The warning was written in a cramped, elegant hand he recognized instantly. It was the mark of the Aether-Guild's enforcers. He was no longer an invisible clerk, he was a target. Eirik's thumb traced the jagged edge of the parchment. The ink was not ink at all, but dried, dark crimson. He smelled the faint metallic tang of copper, mixed with the rot of the tannery. His eyes darted to the dark corners of the room. Shadows stretched across the floorboards like long, grasping fingers. He sensed the weight of a gaze pressing against the back of his neck. The floorboards groaned under the heavy tread of boots in the hallway. Eirik ducked behind the heavy oak workbench. His heart thudded against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drum. He gripped the hilt of his rusted knife until his knuckles turned white. The doorframe splintered as a heavy object struck it from the outside. A man stepped into the room, silhouetted by the dim moonlight. The intruder wore the charcoal-gray cloak of a guild Inquisitor. A silver mask covered the lower half of his face, polished to a mirror sheen. He held a long, thin rod that crackled with a faint violet light. The rod hummed, vibrating in time with the residue of Eirik's experiment. The Inquisitor turned his head slowly, scanning the wreckage of the workshop. He stopped at the work table, his eyes fixing on the blood-stained spike. Eirik watched the man's boots move across the sawdust-covered floor. The Inquisitor paused, tilting his head as if listening to the air itself. A small brass device on the man's chest began to tick rapidly. It was a seeker clock, designed to track fluctuations in the city's copper veins. The ticking grew louder, echoing through the cramped, airless room. The Inquisitor raised the rod, pointing it directly at the workbench. Eirik pressed his back against the cold stone foundation. He knew the copper wiring behind the walls was still hot to the touch. The Inquisitor reached out, his gloved hand hovering over a hidden seam in the wall. He ripped away a panel of wood, revealing the glowing, pulsing circuit Eirik had hidden. The blue light cast long, distorted shadows across the Inquisitor's silver mask. The man let out a low, satisfied hiss of breath. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a heavy iron seal. He pressed the seal against the copper coil, crushing the delicate filaments. The light flickered, dying in a shower of sparks that singed the air. Eirik bit his lip to stifle a sharp, involuntary gasp. The Inquisitor straightened, his eyes snapping toward the workbench. He knew exactly where the shadow fell, and he knew who hid within it. The man strode forward, his heavy boots crushing glass underfoot. Eirik lunged from behind the desk, his knife raised high. The blade caught the moonlight, flashing a dull, lethal silver. The Inquisitor pivoted, his movement fluid and inhumanly fast. He struck Eirik across the chest with the heavy end of his rod. Pain erupted in Eirik's ribs, white-hot and blindingly sharp. He collapsed, his breath hitching as the air left his lungs in a rush. The Inquisitor stood over him, his silver mask gleaming in the gloom. He reached down, grabbing Eirik by the collar of his grease-stained coat. He hauled Eirik upward, slamming him back against the splintered wall. Eirik's vision blurred, the edges of the room turning to gray static. The Inquisitor leaned in close, the smell of ozone clinging to his cloak. He whispered a single word, his voice raspy and devoid of warmth. The word was a name, one that Eirik had not heard in 10 years. Eirik's eyes widened, his head lolling to the side in agony. The Inquisitor dropped him, letting his body hit the floor with a dull thud. The man turned toward the door, his mission clearly accomplished. He did not look back, his confidence absolute and terrifying. Eirik dragged himself toward the workbench, his fingers scraping the dirt. He reached for a hidden lever beneath the bottom shelf. The floor beneath the desk shifted, revealing a narrow, dark crawlspace. He slid into the gap just as heavy footsteps returned to the room. The Inquisitor paced the length of the workshop, his rod swinging rhythmically. He stopped directly above the hidden trapdoor, his boots inches from Eirik's head. The man tapped the floor with his heel, searching for a hollow sound. Eirik held his breath, his chest burning with the effort of silence. He gripped a cold metal pipe that ran along the underside of the floor. The Inquisitor paused, his head cocked toward the floorboards. He raised his rod, the tip glowing with a dangerous building intensity. He plunged the rod through a gap in the wood, aiming for the dark void below. Eirik rolled to the side, the metal tip sparking against the stone floor. The heat was intense, singing the hair on his arms and back. He scrambled deeper into the crawlspace, his body aching with every movement. The Inquisitor ripped the floorboards open, revealing the dark, cramped tunnel. He shone a beam of concentrated light into the hole, illuminating the dust. Eirik pressed himself into a corner, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Inquisitor growled, his voice distorted by the narrow shaft. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small glass vial. He smashed it against the floor, releasing a thick, choking cloud of vapor. The gas filled the crawlspace, stinging Eirik's eyes and burning his throat. He coughed, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the confined space. The Inquisitor's hand shot into the hole, his fingers grasping at the dark. Eirik kicked out, his boot striking the man's armored wrist. The Inquisitor pulled back, his mask revealing only a sliver of cold blue eyes. He began to clear the floorboards, tearing the wood away with brute strength. Eirik crawled forward, his hands finding the exit grate at the rear of the shop. He pushed against the rusted iron bars, his shoulders straining with the effort. The grate gave way with a screech of protesting metal. He tumbled out into the muddy alleyway, the cold rain hitting his face. He did not look back, scrambling to his feet despite the pain in his ribs. He sprinted toward the main thoroughfare, his lungs burning with every breath. The city was waking up, the sound of distant bells marking the hour. He ducked into a narrow side street, his coat heavy with rainwater. He needed to reach the lower docks, where the guild's influence was weakest. He kept his head down, his shadow blending into the tall, soot-stained buildings. The Inquisitor's voice echoed in his mind, cold and filled with iron. He realized the guild did not just fear his invention, they knew his history. He reached the edge of the canal, the water black and sluggish below. A ferryboat sat moored to the docks, its lantern flickering in the wind. He climbed over the railing, his boots sliding on the wet wood. The captain turned, his face hidden beneath a wide, sodden hat. Eirik pressed a damp, crumpled coin into the man's calloused hand. The captain nodded, casting off the ropes without asking a single question. The boat drifted into the current, the city receding into the dark mist. Eirik looked back at the skyline, the chimneys belching smoke into the sky. His workshop was gone, his work was burned, and his life was forfeit. He sat on the deck, his hands trembling as he reached into his bag. He pulled out a single, copper-wound crystal he had hidden in his boot. It pulsed with a soft, steady light, unaffected by the destruction behind him. The revolution was not in the building, it was in his blood. He watched the light, his jaw set in a line of quiet, dangerous resolve. The guild had taken his home, but they had left him the spark. He closed his eyes, the cold rain washing the soot from his skin. The journey to the southern front was long, and he was alone. But the light in his hand grew brighter, a beacon in the dark. He was no longer a clerk, and he was no longer afraid. The boat turned toward the open river, disappearing into the gray, unending night. The rain turned the city streets into slick, black mirrors. Eirik pulled his collar high against the biting wind. He wore the stolen robes of a junior guild auditor. The heavy fabric smelled of stale incense and damp wool. He approached the massive iron gates of the royal foundry. 2 guards stood motionless, their halberds reflecting the dim gaslight. Eirik reached into his satchel and produced a forged seal. His hands trembled slightly beneath the deep, concealing sleeves. The lead guard stepped forward to inspect the document. Eirik held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. The guard's gaze scanned the parchment with practiced suspicion. The seal glowed with a faint, artificial blue resonance. The guard stepped back and lowered his weapon in salute. The heavy gate groaned, swinging open on rusted hinges. Eirik walked into the courtyard, his boots clicking on wet stone. Stacks of raw copper ingots loomed like mountains in the dark. He moved toward the smelting pit, his eyes searching for purity. He needed the most conductive metal to bridge the 5-mile gap. A foreman approached, his face etched with deep, soot-filled lines. Eirik gestured toward the inventory logs with a cold, sharp flick. He demanded an immediate audit of the high-grade copper reserves. The foreman hesitated, glancing toward the glowing Aether-Guild tower. Eirik maintained his icy stare, projecting a mask of absolute authority. The foreman sighed and gestured toward the secure storage shed. Eirik entered the dim room, the air thick with metallic dust. He selected a dozen coils, their surface bright and unoxidized. He felt the weight of the metal dragging on his tired shoulders. Each coil felt heavier than the last, draining his remaining strength. He exited the foundry, his pace steady despite his burning lungs. He ducked into the labyrinthine alleys of the lower district. The shadows clung to him, hiding the stolen bounty. He reached a derelict watchtower overlooking the northern outskirts. His fingers worked with frantic speed, stripping the copper wire. He climbed the crumbling brickwork to reach the highest point. He secured the wire to the iron spire with a jagged knot. His hands bled, the copper biting into his calloused skin. He descended, spooling the line through the mud and debris. 5 miles of wire stretched across the city's jagged skyline. The effort sent a sharp, white-hot spike through his chest. He collapsed against a damp wall, his vision blurring at the edges. He coughed, and a dark metallic spray splattered the cobblestones. He wiped his mouth with a shaking hand, staring at the red stains. His vitality was the price for the connection he forged. He connected the final terminal to a salvaged brass key. He sat in the silence, listening to the hum of the wire. He pressed the key, sending a test pulse into the void. The machine clicked, a sharp, rhythmic sound in the night air. It worked, the signal carrying across the distance in seconds. He intercepted a transmission intended for the frontline generals. The message was a delay order, signed by Hrolf Grendel himself. It instructed the commanders to withhold ammunition for another week. Eirik stared at the text, his stomach churning with cold fury. The Guild was not just controlling the flow of information. They were feeding the war to keep the city in perpetual fear. The stalemate was a cage, and the Guild held the only key. He felt the life draining from his limbs, his bones turning to lead. He had built his bridge, but the cost was etched into his marrow. A shadow flickered at the end of the alley, tall and silent. Eirik scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He realized he was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was a target, hunted by the very power he sought to break. The copper wire pulsed with a faint, dying light in the rain. He turned and vanished into the dark, leaving the truth behind. The shadow detached itself from the brickwork with a fluid, predatory grace. It was a man in a long charcoal duster that blended perfectly into the wet masonry. His face remained hidden beneath the low brim of a wide-brimmed hat. Eirik pressed his back against the cold, slime-coated stone of the alley wall. His fingers tightened around the brass key, the metal edge biting into his palm. The stranger took a step forward, the click of his heels echoing like a countdown. I have to find a way out before he closes the distance. Eirik scanned the narrow path, his eyes snagging on a pile of discarded wooden crates. He shifted his weight, his boots sliding slightly on the slick, oil-stained cobblestones. The stranger raised a gloved hand, holding a slender, silver-tipped cane. He tapped the ground, and the tip emitted a faint, rhythmic violet flicker. It was a tracking beacon, tuned to the specific resonance of the copper wire. The guild did not just rely on spies. They hunted with the very tools he stole. Eirik exhaled, his breath forming a ragged white cloud in the freezing air. He kicked the crate hard, sending it skidding across the path toward the stranger. The wooden box splintered against the brick, showering the alley in sharp, jagged shards. The stranger swerved, his movement blurring as he danced around the debris. Eirik did not wait to see the outcome of the distraction. He lunged toward the narrow gap between the buildings, his muscles screaming in protest. His chest felt like it was filled with jagged glass, every movement a fresh agony. He scrambled up a rusted fire escape, the iron rungs groaning under his weight. Rain lashed against his face, stinging like needles in the biting wind. He reached the rooftop, his lungs burning with the sharp metallic taste of his own blood. He looked down, his eyes widening as he saw the stranger standing at the base of the wall. The man did not climb. He simply tilted his head, his eyes glowing with a faint artificial light. He pointed the cane upward, and a beam of violet energy scorched the air. The brickwork beside Eirik's head exploded, sending a spray of dust into his eyes. He ducked, his shoulder slamming into a chimney stack to maintain his balance. The guild's enforcer was not merely a hunter, he was an extension of their central grid. Eirik crawled across the slate tiles, his hands raw and slick with mud. He reached the edge of the roof, the gap to the next building a terrifying void. The street below was a dark, swirling river of black water and distant, flickering gaslight. He jumped, his arms windmilling as he cleared the distance between the two structures. His fingers hooked onto the rusted ledge of the neighboring building, the metal biting deep. He hauled himself up, his fingernails tearing as he clawed for purchase. He collapsed onto the flat roof, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could hear the stranger's boots hitting the fire escape, a steady, rhythmic ascent. He rolled onto his back, gasping for air that felt too thin to sustain him. His gaze fell upon a tangled nest of discarded cables running along the rooftop. They were old, frayed, and coated in a thick layer of soot and age. He reached out, his trembling fingers tracing the weave of the insulation. The copper inside still held a faint, residual charge from the city's main supply. He had to disrupt the signal before the enforcer reached the rooftop. He pulled the brass key from his pocket, his knuckles white with the exertion. He jammed the key into the junction box, his body shuddering as the current surged. A blue arc of static snapped between his fingers, the smell of ozone filling the air. He forced the energy to reverse, pushing it back down the line toward the street. The wire groaned, the copper turning cherry red beneath his touch. The stranger stopped mid-climb, his cane emitting a high, piercing whine of distress. The violet light flickered, turned an angry, unstable orange, and then shattered. The enforcer stumbled, his hand clutching his chest as the feedback loop took hold. He fell backward, the heavy thud of his body echoing in the narrow alleyway. Eirik did not stay to watch the aftermath of his desperation. He stood up, his legs shaking, and began to run across the sprawling network of rooftops. The city stretched out before him, a labyrinth of smoke, secrets, and iron. He saw the distant lights of the palace, the seat of the guild's absolute power. He realized now that he could not just break their machines. He had to dismantle the entire suffocating weight of their influence on the city. He reached a ventilation shaft, the warmth from the factory below rising to meet him. He sat down, his back against the warm iron, and wiped the blood from his lip. The city was a cage, but he was finally beginning to understand how to pick the lock. He closed his eyes for a moment, the hum of the city vibrating through his spine. He was tired, he was bleeding, and he was completely alone in the dark. But he held the key to the silence, and that was enough to keep going. He stood up, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first hint of gray dawn waited. The war was a lie, and he was the only one who knew how to speak the truth. He stepped into the shadows of a soot-stained chimney, disappearing from the world. He moved with a new, quiet purpose, his footsteps light on the rain-slick tiles. Every drop of blood he left behind was a testament to the price of his defiance. He reached the end of the roof and descended into the dark, welcoming maze of the slums. The guild would come looking for him, but he was already drifting further into the deep. He was the ghost in the machine, and he was just getting started. The foundry entrance loomed like a titan's iron throat. Steam hissed from massive brass pipes, obscuring the view of the soot-stained courtyard. Eirik smoothed the stiff, formal collar of the stolen auditor's coat. His fingers brushed the cold, heavy seal pinned to his chest. The metal felt like a brand against his skin. He walked toward the gate with a measured, practiced stride. A guard stepped forward, his spear tip glinting in the dim, yellow gaslight. The man squinted at the seal, his brow furrowing in confusion. Eirik did not wait for the challenge. He pulled a stack of forged manifest papers from his satchel with a sharp snap. He gestured toward the flickering furnace fires with a look of practiced annoyance. The auditor requires an immediate inventory of the high-conductivity copper stores. The guard looked at the seal, then at the soot on Eirik's face, and finally at the papers. He stepped back and gestured toward the heavy iron doors. The gates groaned open, revealing a cavernous hall filled with the rhythmic thrum of hammers. Eirik stepped into the heat, the air thick with the metallic tang of molten ore. He navigated the labyrinth of cooling racks and massive vibrating presses. His eyes scanned the walls for the telltale blue shimmer of pure, refined conduction wire. It sat in a corner, coiled in heavy, gleaming spools of deep, burnished orange. He reached the supply bin and checked the perimeter with a sharp, flicking glance. 2 workers were distracted by a jammed press near the center of the hall. He dropped to his knees behind a stack of iron ingots. He pulled a small, jagged cutting tool from his sleeve. His hands trembled, but he forced them to remain steady against the cold metal. He sliced a length of the wire, the copper singing as it gave way. A sudden, sharp pain bloomed deep within his lungs. He coughed, a wet, ragged sound that he stifled against his sleeve. He pulled his hand away and saw a dark, viscous smear of blood on the fabric. The cost of the connection was rising. He ignored the metallic taste in his mouth and shoved the wire into his satchel. He stood up, his vision swimming with gray, static-filled spots. A ledger sat on a nearby desk, its pages open to a shipping manifest. He glanced at the dates, his breath hitching in his throat. The orders for the front line were marked as delayed by 3 months. The Guild kept the war burning by starving the army of supplies. They needed the city in a constant, trembling state of panic to maintain their control. Eirik shoved the ledger into his satchel alongside the stolen copper. He turned toward the side exit, his movements stiff and deliberate. A supervisor stood near the door, his eyes locked on Eirik's hurried gait. The man tapped a rhythm on his clipboard, his expression unreadable. Eirik forced a thin, professional smile and nodded toward the exit. The supervisor tipped his cap, a silent acknowledgement of the auditor's rank. Eirik crossed the threshold into the cool, biting air of the alleyway. He did not stop until he reached the derelict clock tower on the city's edge. He climbed the rotted wooden stairs, his chest aching with every heartbeat. At the summit, he began the work of threading the wire through the rafters. His fingers moved with frantic, desperate speed. He connected the end of the spool to a discarded telegraph key he had salvaged earlier. The wire hummed, a low, vibrant frequency that resonated in his teeth. He tapped the key, his finger tracing the rhythm of the city's hidden pulse. The connection held, a 5-mile bridge of copper stretching across the rooftops. He collapsed against the cold, damp stone of the tower wall. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps. He looked at his hands, watching them shake with an uncontrollable, rhythmic tremor. The mark of the power was a permanent, weeping shadow on his skin. He stared out at the city, the sprawling, dark cage of the Guild's design. He had the means to broadcast the truth now. The silence of the city was about to be broken by a single, resonant signal. He closed his eyes, his head resting against the rough brick. The war was a machine, and he had just found the gear that would jam it forever. The clock tower air tasted of ozone and ancient dust. Eirik adjusted the copper coil, his fingers trembling against the sharp, biting edges of the wire. The telegraph key sat on a splintered crate before him. He pressed the brass lever, sending a rhythmic pulse into the dark, silent city. The receiver needle jumped, clattering against its housing. A message arrived from the central terminal, the ink-stained ribbon twitching with unnatural speed. He read the incoming code, his brow furrowing in confusion. The dispatch claimed the Vilos coalition had already breached the northern walls. He tapped a query back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The response came instantly, detailing troop movements that contradicted every report he had intercepted before. A heavy silence filled the room, pressing against his ears. He realized the line was not a window into the truth, but a mirror reflecting a carefully constructed lie. The floorboards groaned behind him. Eirik spun around, his hand flying to the heavy iron wrench tucked into his belt. Shadows detached themselves from the rafters, shifting with predatory grace. 3 men in the dark, high-collared uniforms of the Aether-Guild stepped into the moonlight. One of them held a glowing, soul-bound avian familiar. The creature's eyes burned with a sickly, violet light that illuminated the entire room. They were not here to kill him. They were here to harvest the source of the signal. Eirik looked at his telegraph key, then at the sprawling network of copper wire he had painstakingly laid across the city. He saw the trap for what it was. Hrolf Grendel had allowed him to build the bridge just so he could walk across it and find his prey. The lead agent raised a hand, and the avian creature shrieked, a sound that vibrated in Eirik's very marrow. The air in the room grew heavy and cold. Eirik lunged toward the main power junction, his boots sliding on the slick, dust-covered floor. He grabbed the primary copper lead with both hands. The current surged through his veins, a searing, white-hot agony that defied description. He felt his vitality draining away, a river of light flowing from his body into the wire. He slammed the connection into the main support beam of the tower. The copper groaned, glowing a furious, blinding orange as it reached its breaking point. A massive electrical arc erupted from the terminal, a jagged whip of lightning that tore through the rafters. The room exploded in a shower of sparks and shattered stone. The guild agents screamed as the light struck them, their soul-bound familiar dissolving into a puff of gray ash. They stumbled backward, clawing at their eyes as the intensity of the discharge blinded them. Eirik collapsed to his knees, his vision blurring into a haze of dark, swirling static. The tower shook, the structure groaning under the strain of the overload. He crawled toward the window, his lungs burning with the sharp metallic scent of ozone. He looked back once, watching the telegraph key melt into a shapeless lump of slag. His prototype was gone, turned to wreckage in the wake of his desperation. He vaulted over the sill, landing hard on the rain-slicked roof of the adjacent building. He ran until his chest felt like it was filled with jagged glass. He reached the alley where his mentor, old Silas, usually waited for his return. The alley was empty, save for a single, discarded lantern and a smear of fresh blood on the cobblestones. A piece of parchment lay pinned to the brickwork with a familiar guild dagger. Eirik snatched the paper, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. The note was brief, written in the cold, precise hand of Hrolf Grendel. He had traded his mentor for his own survival. The guild had taken Silas to the central terminal to serve as the fuel for their next, more permanent transmission. Eirik leaned against the damp wall, the cold rain soaking into his clothes. He looked up at the silhouette of the city, now plunged into an even deeper, more oppressive silence. The infrastructure he had built was shattered, its copper veins torn from the rooftops like dead nerves. He was alone, and the city's only path to the truth had been burned away. He stared at the blood on the wall, the dark stain gleaming under the flickering street lamp. The game had changed, and the stakes had shifted from survival to a quiet, burning vengeance. He turned away from the alley, his steps heavy and measured. He was no longer building a bridge, he was preparing a blade. He pressed his palms against the rough brickwork of the alleyway. The cold rain turned the blood on the wall into a dark, viscous smear. A jagged tear in his tunic exposed a purple bruise blooming across his ribs. His fingers curled into tight fists. He looked down at the discarded lantern left in the mud. The oil inside had long since leaked out, leaving the glass dark and hollow. Silas had been here. The old man's cane lay snapped in two near the crate. He reached down to touch the splintered wood. The grain felt cold and brittle under his fingertips. A scrap of fabric snagged on a nail caught his eye. It was a piece of the heavy gray wool Silas wore every winter. He shoved the scrap into his pocket. The city above him groaned under the weight of the storm. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled from the central terminal. It was not a signal of time. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He stood up and wiped the grit from his face. The guild was not just using the wires for messages anymore. They were using the copper grid to track every pulse of energy in the district. His own invention had become a cage for the entire city. He turned toward the labyrinth of the lower slums. The narrow streets were choked with thick, swirling fog. He kept his head low, mimicking the gait of a common laborer. His breath hitched in his throat as a patrol passed by. 3 men in heavy leather coats marched toward the high-walled spire. They carried lanterns that burned with a harsh, artificial blue flame. He tucked himself into the shadow of a rotting archway. One of the guards stopped and sniffed the air. The man's eyes scanned the darkness with predatory focus. He held his breath until his lungs began to ache. The guard turned his head toward the sound of a stray cat. He signaled his companions, and they continued their patrol. Eirik exhaled, the sound barely audible over the patter of rain. He needed a way to reach the central terminal without using the grid. The guild kept their power sources deep beneath the foundation. He looked at the iron grate covering the city's main drainage tunnel. It was rusted, but the locking mechanism remained intact. He reached into his bag for a small, jagged piece of copper wire. He jammed the metal into the keyhole. He twisted his wrist with a sharp, calculated motion. The lock clicked, a dull metallic sound that echoed in the quiet. He heaved the heavy grate upward. The smell of stagnant water and ancient sewage rose to meet him. He climbed down into the dark, slick belly of the city. Water dripped from the stone ceiling, hitting his shoulders like lead. He waded through the knee-deep sludge. The tunnel walls were lined with old pipes, long since abandoned. He traced the path of a thick, lead-encased cable running along the wall. This was the auxiliary line for the guild's private quarters. He knelt in the filth and pulled a small knife from his belt. He began to scrape away the thick, protective casing. His skin grew pale, his veins pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic glow. This was the cost of his work, a hunger that gnawed at his marrow. He ignored the tremors in his hands. He stripped the wire, revealing the bright, conductive heart of the cable. He connected his own copper strand to the exposed line. A low hum began to vibrate through the tunnel. He closed his eyes and pushed his focus into the metal. The world dissolved into a map of shimmering golden lines. He saw the city from beneath, a web of pulsing light and shadow. The central terminal stood at the heart of it all, a glowing monolith. A dark mass of energy shifted within the tower's base. It was Silas, his life force being drained to fuel the transmission array. He saw the old man's silhouette, frail and trembling against a glass cage. The sight sent a cold, sharp spike through his chest. He pushed more of his own energy into the connection. The tunnel lights flickered and died. He felt his strength slipping away, his limbs turning to lead. He forced his consciousness toward the terminal's main regulator. The machine was a complex assembly of brass gears and soul-bound crystals. He visualized a surge of feedback, a hammer blow to the system. The copper wire in his hand began to heat up. It turned a dull, angry red in the darkness. He felt the resistance of the Guild's security wards. They pushed back, a psychic weight that threatened to crush his mind. He grit his teeth, blood trickling from his nose onto the stone. He poured every ounce of his remaining vitality into the loop. The terminal's central crystal cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The blue glow in the tunnel exploded into blinding white. He collapsed backward into the freezing water. The surge of energy traveled up the line, tearing through the insulation. He watched as the distant terminal erupted in a cascade of sparks. The ground shook, sending dust raining down from the tunnel ceiling. He scrambled to his feet, gasping for air. His hands were burned, the skin raw and smoking. He climbed the ladder toward the street level, his movements sluggish. He emerged into a plaza filled with confused, shouting guards. The terminal was dark, its eternal glow extinguished by the overload. He melted into the panicked crowd, his hood pulled low. He saw a figure being dragged out of the side entrance. It was Silas, his clothes tattered and his head lolling against his chest. A carriage waited in the square, its wheels turning on the cobbles. He gripped his belt, his knuckles white with suppressed rage. The carriage door slammed shut with a final echoing thud. The horses bolted, their hooves striking sparks on the wet pavement. He stood frozen in the middle of the street. He watched the taillights fade into the oppressive, heavy fog. The silence that followed was absolute. He reached into his pocket and touched the scrap of gray wool. The city was dark, but the path ahead was finally clear. He did not need wires to find them anymore. He turned toward the edge of the district, his eyes hard and cold. The blade he was forging had finally found its edge. Eirik pulled his damp coat tight against the biting wind of the Oakhaven market. He clutched a heavy leather satchel against his ribs. Inside, a coil of copper wire hummed with a faint, residual heat. General Solveig Holm stood near the stone fountain, her uniform stiff with polished brass buttons. Her face was a map of deep lines and exhaustion. She watched the passing soldiers with eyes that had seen too many casualty reports. Eirik stepped into her line of sight, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He bowed, his posture rigid like a common clerk. General Holm glanced at him, her gaze sharpening with a flicker of recognition. She turned away from her escort and walked toward the quiet shade of a nearby archway. Eirik followed, his boots making rhythmic thuds on the wet cobblestones. He opened his satchel just enough to show the metallic glint of his invention. He whispered that the Guild was stalling her supplies to fuel their own political games. The general's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in her pale cheek. She stared at the copper wire, her hand hovering over the hilt of her sword. Eirik promised that a private line would bypass their birds and their lies. She looked at the bustling square, then back at the disgraced engineer. He needed the military's high-grade forge to build a signal amplifier. She demanded proof of his claims, her voice low and dangerous. Eirik pulled a small hand-cranked device from his bag and placed it on a wooden crate. He twisted the brass handle, and a tiny spark jumped between two iron prongs. The air smelled of ozone, a sharp, unnatural scent in the damp city air. General Holm reached out, her gloved finger hovering inches from the sparking metal. She agreed to the alliance, her eyes cold with the weight of her decision. A heavy iron key slid across the crate, landing with a dull, ringing thud. It was the key to the military's restricted foundry, hidden in the city's industrial district. Eirik took the key, his fingers trembling slightly as he tucked it away. That evening, the banquet hall glowed with the light of 1,000 flickering candles. Eirik adjusted his borrowed collar, the silk fabric scratching his neck. General Holm sat at the head of the long table, her expression unreadable. Across the room, Magister Hrolf Grendel watched the guests with a predatory stillness. He wore robes of deep velvet violet, embroidered with silver threads that seemed to pulse. Eirik felt the weight of the Magister's gaze like a physical pressure on his spine. Waiters moved between the tables, placing crystal goblets of dark, spiced wine. Eirik kept his hands beneath the table, clutching a small, concealed transmitter. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm in the stifling room. Hrolf Grendel stood up, his movement smooth and utterly silent. He walked toward Eirik's table, the crowd parting before his shadow. The Magister stopped behind Eirik, his long, thin fingers resting on the back of the chair. He leaned down, his breath cold against Eirik's ear. He spoke of the beauty of a well-crafted machine and the tragedy of its inevitable decay. Hrolf Grendel gestured to the center of the table, where a silver platter sat empty. He commanded Eirik to show the guests the true nature of his work. Eirik reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, brass-cased telegraph key. He placed it on the velvet cloth, the metal gleaming under the chandelier's light. Hrolf Grendel smiled, though his eyes remained as flat as polished slate. The Magister tapped the device, a single, sharp, metallic click echoing through the hall. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the music. He called Eirik by his full name, his tone dripping with mocking familiarity. He knew about the foundry, the stolen copper, and the secret line to the front. Eirik felt his blood run cold, his vision blurring at the edges. Hrolf Grendel pulled a small, blood-stained locket from his sleeve and dropped it onto the table. It was the silver chain Eirik's mentor had worn until the day he vanished. The Magister leaned back, his expression one of calm, terrifying amusement. He offered a simple choice. The engineer could serve the guild and live as a puppet. Or, he could watch the last of his friends suffer the slow burn of the soulbind. Eirik looked at the locket, then up into the Magister's depthless, dark eyes. The room seemed to tilt, the sound of the guests fading into a dull, rhythmic roar. Hrolf Grendel turned away, his robes sweeping the floor like a funeral shroud. He left the room, his presence lingering like the chill of an open grave. Eirik sat in the silence, his hands locked together beneath the table. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavier than the stone walls surrounding him. He looked at General Holm, but she was staring intently into her wine. The path forward was blocked by a wall of absolute crushing power. He reached into his pocket, his fingers finding the sharp edge of a copper shard. He did not need wires to know that the trap had finally closed. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy and uncertain on the polished floor. He walked toward the exit, ignoring the confused stares of the noble guest. The night air outside felt like ice against his flushed, burning skin. He headed into the shadows of the alley, his mind racing with impossible variables. The guild had the leverage, but they still lacked his understanding of the circuit. He would build a new path, even if it cost him the very air in his lungs. He started toward the foundry, his silhouette disappearing into the thick, swirling fog. Eirik pressed his back against the rough brickwork of the alleyway. His lungs burned with the effort of every shallow breath. He pulled the copper shard from his pocket and held it to the dim moonlight. The metal caught the pale glow and reflected a jagged, broken sliver of his own face. He needed a distraction that did not rely on wires or sparks. A group of merchants huddled by the foundry gate, clutching thick leather satchels. They were guild couriers, waiting for the night shift to unlock the heavy iron doors. Eirik adjusted his coat to hide the stains of his recent escape. He stepped into the flickering light of a nearby street lamp. He reached into his bag and withdrew a small, heavy pouch of stolen silver. The coins clinked with a sound that stopped the couriers in their tracks. He tossed the pouch toward the lead merchant, the leather thudding against the cobblestones. The merchant stared at the silver, his eyes widening with instant, greedy recognition. Eirik gestured toward the foundry's secondary maintenance entrance. He promised the man a full share of the next shipment if he simply looked away. The merchant hesitated, his hand hovering over the hilt of a hidden dagger. He looked at the towering walls of the foundry, then back at the silver. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement of his chin. The couriers retreated into the shadows, their boots scraping softly against the stone. Eirik approached the maintenance door and pressed his palm against the iron. The metal was freezing, biting into his skin with a dull, persistent ache. He pulled a thin wire from his sleeve and jammed it into the lock mechanism. He didn't use electricity this time. He used the mechanical tension of the tumblers. The lock clicked, a sound like a snapping bone in the quiet night. He slipped inside the foundry, the air thick with the smell of coal dust. Massive, cold machines loomed in the dark like sleeping iron beasts. He moved toward the central furnace, his footsteps muffled by thick layers of soot. He found the master ledger sitting on a pedestal near the cooling vats. He opened the heavy tome, the pages stiff and crusted with dried ink. It contained a list of every shipment sent to the front lines this month. He scanned the entries, his finger tracing the lines of precise calligraphic script. The guild was falsifying the delivery dates to keep the army starved of supplies. He pulled a piece of charcoal from his pocket and marked the ledger pages. He didn't just want to steal copper, he wanted to expose the entire supply chain. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from the rafters high above the floor. Eirik froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. A shadow detached itself from the ceiling, dropping silently onto a stack of crates. It was a guild scout, dressed in black leather that absorbed the surrounding light. The scout drew a short, curved blade that shimmered with a faint, oily residue. Eirik didn't reach for his device. He grabbed a heavy iron wrench from the workbench. He threw the tool with all his remaining strength, aiming for the scout's chest. The wrench whistled through the air and struck the scout's shoulder with a sickening crunch. The man gasped, his grip on the blade loosening as he stumbled backward. Eirik lunged forward and shoved the scout into the cooling vat. The water hissed and bubbled as the man struggled to find his footing. Eirik grabbed a heavy chain hanging from the rafters and whipped it around the vat. He locked the chain in place, trapping the scout inside the narrow, iron-rimmed basin. The scout clawed at the metal, his fingers leaving deep, jagged scratches in the steel. Eirik turned back to the ledger and ripped out the incriminating pages. He stuffed the parchment into his vest, the paper crinkling against his chest. He moved toward the exit, his movements fluid and driven by a desperate focus. He reached the street just as the first rays of dawn touched the city spires. The sky turned a bruised purple, casting long, distorted shadows across the plaza. He saw General Holm standing near the city gates, her armor gleaming in the light. She watched the horizon, her hand resting on the pommel of her sword. Eirik approached her, his boots heavy with the dust of the foundry. He stopped 10 paces away and held out the crumpled, charcoal-marked ledger pages. The general took the papers, her eyes scanning the evidence with icy intensity. She looked at Eirik, her expression shifting from suspicion to a grim, silent resolve. She understood the scale of the betrayal now, the depth of the guild's rot. She tucked the pages into her breastplate, the metal clinking softly as they settled. The deal was no longer about a telegraph line. It was about a revolution. She signaled to her guards, who stood in a rigid line along the wall. They turned their backs to the alley, creating a temporary shield of steel and leather. Eirik felt a surge of adrenaline, his fatigue momentarily forgotten in the cold morning air. He pulled the small telegraph device from his pocket and adjusted the tension screw. He connected a wire to the iron gate, grounding the circuit into the city's frame. He tapped the key, sending a rapid, rhythmic pulse of energy through the metal. The air hummed with a low, vibrating drone that set his teeth on edge. Across the square, a hidden receiver on the general's carriage began to click. The sound was faint, but in the morning silence, it rang out like a bell. General Holm listened to the rhythmic tapping, her eyes reflecting the rising sun. She nodded at Eirik, a rare, fleeting expression of respect crossing her hardened features. She reached into her cloak and produced a heavy, wax-sealed scroll. It was an official commission, granting Eirik the status of a royal military engineer. The document carried the weight of the crown, enough to override any guild decree. Eirik took the scroll, his fingers brushing the rough, textured paper. He looked back toward the palace, where Hrolf Grendel's influence still held sway. The guild would come for him, but they would have to face the army first. He turned his back on the city, walking toward the sprawling, gray-walled barracks. The ground beneath his feet felt solid, no longer shifting under the weight of his fear. He reached the barracks gate and showed the commission to the startled sentry. The guard stepped aside, his eyes wide as he saluted the disgraced engineer. Eirik entered the compound, the sound of marching boots echoing in the wide yard. He found a quiet corner in the logistics office and set up his equipment. He didn't just need to send messages, he needed to build a secure network. He stripped the copper wire from his bag and began to coil it around the rafters. Each loop added a layer of protection, a web of conductive metal against the walls. He felt the familiar sharp sting of a static discharge against his thumb. He ignored the pain, his eyes fixed on the flickering blue sparks in the air. Outside, the city began to wake, the bells of the cathedral tolling a mournful rhythm. He sat at the desk and tapped out the first code to the front lines. The message carried the truth about the missing supplies and the guild's treachery. He watched the needle on his gauge jump, indicating the signal had successfully traveled. Across the distant horizon, he imagined the soldiers reading the news of their salvation. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He was no longer a puppet or a thief. He was the architect of their downfall. A knock sounded at the office door, slow and deliberate, like the tolling of a bell. Eirik didn't move, his hand hovering over the telegraph key. The door swung open, revealing a messenger in the livery of the Royal Guard. The man bowed, his face pale, and his hands trembling as he held out a letter. Eirik took the missive, the seal bearing the crest of the Magister's private order. He broke the wax, the sound sharp and final, in the small, cramped room. The letter contained only a single coordinate and a time, written in Hrolf's elegant, cruel hand. It was an invitation to a place where no armies could reach them. Eirik stood up, his legs steady, his mind clear of all hesitation. He gathered his tools, the brass and copper clinking with a promise of war. He walked out of the barracks, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the sky. The city was a trap, but he had finally learned how to dismantle the springs. He stepped into the street, the cold air rushing into his lungs like a challenge. He did not look back at the palace, nor at the shadows where the guild lurked. He walked toward the coordinates, his pace measured and his heart beating in steady time. The path forward was paved with the same copper he had bled to secure. Every step was a circuit, every breath a charge, every heartbeat a signal in the dark. He was the wire, and the current was finally flowing exactly where it needed to go. The northern wind shrieked against the jagged mountain pass. Eirik gripped the copper wire, his gloves shredded by the relentless ice. The line sagged, a dark, thin vein stretching across the frozen abyss. A sudden snap echoed above the gale, sharp as a breaking bone. The wire whipped through the air, coiling around a distant frosted crag. Eirik collapsed to his knees, his breath blooming in white, jagged clouds. He stared at the severed end, the metal vibrating with a dying hum. He forced his boots to move, dragging his heavy frame toward the cliff edge. The mountain air bit into his skin, numbing the fingers he needed to survive. He reached the break, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the splicing tools. A faint, violet glow pulsed from the copper, rhythmic and sickly. He stared at the surface of the wire, where faint, carved runes shimmered. The guild had marked a line with ether leech sigils, designed to consume. He felt a cold, hollow ache expand within his chest, pulling at his marrow. His vision blurred, the world tilting into a kaleidoscope of gray and blue. He pressed his palm against the exposed copper, ignoring the searing frost. The metal bit into his skin, drawing a dark, viscous line of blood. He channeled his focus, pouring his remaining vitality into the circuit. The runes flared, hungry for the warmth of his life force. He screamed, the sound swallowed instantly by the indifferent, howling wind. The circuit closed, the copper turning white-hot beneath his freezing touch. A jagged bolt of feedback arched from the wire, striking his temple. He felt the world shatter, his left eye turning into a pool of blinding heat. He slumped against the ice, his vision darkening on one side forever. The telegraph key in his pack clicked, a rhythmic, steady pulse of data. He listened to the machine, the message finally reaching the distant front. The soldiers would receive the orders, the truth of the guild's deception. His hand fell limp, the blood staining the snow a deep, vibrant crimson. He looked up at the sky, his remaining eye catching a glimpse of the moon. The mountain pass was silent, save for the faint, steady click of the machine. He was broken, his body a discarded shell in the heart of the storm. He smiled, a thin, cracked line across his frozen, pale face. The information flowed, a silent torrent of truth through the treacherous dark. He felt the weight of his sacrifice, a heavy, permanent stone in his gut. The guild's grip on the Empire would finally begin to unravel tonight. He closed his eye, the cold creeping into his limbs with gentle persistence. The telegraph key clicked one final, resolute time, ending the transmission. He lay amidst the ice, a ghost of the engineer he once was. The wind continued its song, erasing his tracks with a layer of fresh snow. He did not wake, but the message lived on in the hands of the army. A heavy, metallic thud vibrates through the frozen ground. The telegraph machine in his pack emits a final, jagged spark of blue light. Eirik's body remains motionless against the jagged slope of the mountain. The storm howls, a chorus of hungry wolves tearing at the silence of the pass. A thin layer of frost begins to coat his outstretched, blood-stained fingers. Below the ridge, the distant camp of the Border Legion stirs with sudden frantic activity. Lanterns flicker to life, tiny orange embers against the vast, ink-black expanse of the valley. The soldiers read the orders, their silhouettes moving with newfound, desperate purpose. Eirik's left eye remains fixed on the dark, unyielding sky. It is a void of gray, a sightless window into the world he no longer sees. The right eye twitches, focusing on the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the device. The machine continues to chatter, relaying the final verification of the transmission. It is a hollow, metallic sound that echoes against the stones. His chest rises once, a shallow, ragged intake of freezing air. The pain in his temple is a dull, throbbing pressure that refuses to fade. Darkness leaks from the wound on his forehead, staining the white snow into a Rorschach blot. A shadow detaches itself from the crags above, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. It is a guild enforcer, clad in thick, fur-lined armor that muffles the sound of his boots. The man carries a short curved blade that reflects the pale, dying light of the moon. He pauses, his breath forming a ghost-like plume in the biting air. The enforcer kicks the telegraph machine, sending it skittering across the slick ice. Eirik does not move, his jaw locked against the rising tide of agony. The enforcer kneels, his gloved hand tracing the glowing residual runes on the copper wire. He hums, a low, guttural sound of satisfaction that cuts through the wind. The man stands, his gaze sweeping the cliffside for any sign of life. He stops, his eyes locking onto the pale, motionless form of the engineer. Eirik's hand moves, a small, involuntary twitch of his thumb against the frozen ground. The enforcer steps forward, his boots crushing the thin crust of ice. He raises the blade, the metal whistling as it slices through the gale. Eirik's right eye dilates, capturing the flash of steel in the moonlight. A sudden sharp report rings out from the valley floor below. A flare streaks into the sky, illuminating the pass in a harsh, blinding magnesium white. The enforcer stumbles, his focus shattering as the light exposes his position. He looks toward the valley, his face twisted in a mask of sudden, frantic confusion. Eirik lunges, his movement a desperate, uncoordinated scramble of limbs. He grabs the enforcer's ankle, his nails digging into the tough, cured leather of the boot. The man yells, a guttural roar that is swallowed by the mountain wind. He kicks back, his heel connecting with Eirik's ribs with a sickening, wet crunch. Eirik rolls, his body sliding toward the edge of the abyss. He grips a protruding rock, his knuckles white and bleeding from the abrasive stone. The enforcer recovers, looming over him like a monolith carved from shadow. He brings the blade down, but the ground beneath him shifts with a sudden grinding groan. The mountain is unstable, the recent electrical surge having compromised the permafrost. A fissure opens between them, a jagged mouth of black, frozen earth. The enforcer loses his balance, his arms windmilling as he tips into the darkness. He vanishes without a sound, his descent cut short by the roar of the wind. Eirik lies on the precipice, his body trembling from the sudden violent exertion. He stares at the spot where the man stood, his vision swimming with dark, pulsing spots. The telegraph machine sits a few feet away, its brass casing dented and dull. He crawls toward it, his movements sluggish and heavy, as if he were wading through mud. His fingers brush the metal, the cold surface biting into his skin. He drags the device closer, pulling it into the shelter of a limestone shelf. He opens the casing, his hands shaking so violently the parts rattle like dry bones. The internal wiring is frayed, the delicate conduits twisted into useless, jagged knots. He pulls a strand of copper from his own tunic, a remnant of his earlier labor. He touches the wire to the internal terminal, his blood acting as a bridge for the current. The device hums, a low, vibrating drone that sets his teeth on edge. A flicker of white light dances across the dial, steady and defiant. He taps the key, sending a final coded burst toward the distant waiting legion. The message is simple, a confirmation of the path now cleared for their advance. He leans his head back against the stone, the frost clinging to his hair. His strength is a reservoir that has finally completely run dry. The sky begins to lighten, a faint, bruised purple bleeding into the eastern. The wind dies down, leaving the mountain in a state of unnatural, heavy stillness. He watches a single hawk circle far above, a black speck against the encroaching dawn. He feels the cold seeping into his core, a gentle, numbing invitation to rest. The machine gives a final soft click and then goes silent. He closes his right eye, the world fading into a soft, monochromatic blur. The war would continue without him, the gears of the city grinding toward an uncertain end. He is no longer the architect, but the stone that cracked the foundation. A light snow begins to fall, dusting his shoulders in a shroud of white. He is a ghost, a memory of copper and lightning, fading into the mountain's silence. The distance between the living and the dead narrows, a bridge of ice and regret. He does not hear the approaching boots of the Legion, nor the call of his name. He is gone, the signal sent, the circuit permanently, irrevocably broken. A rhythmic snapping sound echoes through the pass. The main copper line whips in the gale like a dying snake. Eirik stares at the dangling ends of the wire. He notes the blackened, charred edges of the copper casing. Tiny, glowing runes etched into the metal pulse with a sickly violet light. These are ether leech marks, designed to drain the warmth from any living conductor. His fingertips brush the wire, and a sudden sharp jolt tears through his nerves. The frost on his jacket turns to steam as the runes feast on his vitality. He recoils, his left eye throbbing with a pressure that feels like a physical weight. A shadow moves on the ridge above the ravine. A guild scout aims a heavy, iron-tipped crossbow toward the exposed line. Eirik drops into the slush, his boots sliding against the jagged shale. A bolt whistles through the space where his head rested a moment ago. It shatters a boulder, sending sharp fragments of granite into the air. He drags his body toward the fractured junction of the telegraph wire. The cold bites into his skin, numbing the fingers of his right hand. He reaches into his tunic and pulls a jagged piece of slate from his side. He presses the stone into his palm, drawing a thin, dark line of blood. He clamps his wounded hand over the severed copper conduit. The ether leech runes flare bright, drinking greedily from his open vein. Agony spikes behind his left temple, blinding him in a flash of crimson. He gasps, his head snapping back against the freezing mountain wall. The world goes gray and lopsided as the vision in his left eye flickers out. His remaining eye captures a dull, persistent darkness where the light used to be. He ignores the encroaching numbness, his focus locked on the machine. The telegraph device begins to hum, vibrating against the frozen earth. He taps out the final sequence with his trembling, blood-slicked fingers. The guild scout reloads, his movements steady and practiced. Eirik watches the scout's silhouette through the haze of his failing vision. He shifts his weight, sliding the heavy brass casing to cover his exposed torso. The bolt slams into the metal, the force nearly knocking him into the abyss. He doesn't flinch, his hand still acting as the bridge for the signal. The machine clicks, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat in the silence of the storm. A faint green light pulses from the terminal, signaling successful transmission. The message travels toward the front lines, bypassing the Guild's blockade of silence. Eirik pulls his hand away, the skin of his palm raw and smoking. He collapses against the limestone, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The scout climbs down from the ridge, his blade drawn for a final blow. Eirik pulls a small, rusted gear from his pocket and tosses it into the snow. The metal makes a sharp, metallic ring against the ice, drawing the scout's gaze. The man turns his head, distracted for a fraction of a second. Eirik kicks a pile of loose, frozen scree into the scout's face. The man stumbles, his boots losing purchase on the slick, treacherous incline. He slides backward, his clawing hands finding no grip on the sheer rock. He falls into the dark, his scream cut short by the wind's howl. Eirik lies still, his chest rising and falling with immense effort. His left eye remains shut, a permanent hollow dark in his field of view. He touches the bandage over his eye, his fingers coming away wet with cold sweat. The mountain pass remains silent, save for the whistling wind. He reaches for his satchel, his movement sluggish and heavily weighed by fatigue. He finds a scrap of parchment and a charcoal stick. He records the coordinates of the Guild's hidden relay station. The ink smears as a flurry of snow drifts over the page. He tucks the paper into the lining of his coat near his heart. He stands, his legs trembling like saplings in a hurricane. He looks toward the horizon where the first light of day touches the peaks. The telegraph line hangs taut, a thin silver thread against the vast gray sky. He knows the general will receive the orders before the sun clears the ridge. He begins the long, painful climb toward the lower valley. Every step sends a jolt of ice-cold pain through his spine. He uses his staff to balance, his left side leaning heavily into the void. He is a broken vessel, leaking strength with every meter he covers. The Guild will hunt the source of the signal until the end of the war. He is no longer just an engineer, but a marked man in a hostile world. He reaches a small natural cave and crawls into the shadows. He huddles against the back wall, his body shivering uncontrollably. He closes his remaining eye, the image of the flickering wire burned into his mind. The war is no longer a set of numbers, but a series of sacrifices. He listens to the wind, waiting for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. He knows the cost was high, but the path is finally open. He drifts into a shallow, restless sleep, his hand gripping the cold stone. Eirik stood in the center of the cramped print shop. His fingers moved with frantic precision over the makeshift telegraph press. He fed the wet ink onto the copper plates. The machine clicked, a metallic stutter that echoed against the damp brick walls. Thin sheets of paper emerged, each stamped with the leaked ledgers of the Aether-Guild. The ink was black and sharp against the cheap, yellowed parchment. He watched the words take form, detailing years of orchestrated famine and artificial stalemate. A young man named Kale stood by the window, clutching a bundle of finished broadsheets. Kale's hands shook, the paper rattling like dry leaves in the quiet room. Outside, the streets of Oakhaven lay under a thick, suffocating fog. Eirik handed him the final stack, his own movements stiff and painful. "Distribute these at the docks and the central plaza," Eirik commanded. Kale nodded, his face pale, and slipped into the shadows of the alleyway. Eirik turned back to his terminal, his breath hitching in his chest. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden ozone-rich static. He looked at the copper wires running along the ceiling, pulsing with a faint, sickly violet hue. Magister Hrolf Grendel had felt the tremor in the information flow. A sudden darkness swallowed the city as the central ether tower cut the streetlights. The hum of the city ceased, replaced by the distant rising roar of a confused populace. Eirik grabbed his coat and stumbled toward the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Shadows lengthened, turning the alley into a jagged throat of black stone. He caught a glimpse of Kale's crumpled body near the corner of the market. The boy lay motionless, his broadsheets scattered like snow across the muddy cobblestones. Eirik knelt beside him, his fingers brushing the boy's cold, still neck. A single glowing rune burned on Kale's collar, the mark of a lethal soul drain. Eirik stared at the symbol, his breath hitching in a jagged sob. The Guild had not just cut the power, they had purged the conduits. He stood, his legs trembling as the weight of his failure pressed down. He looked up at the ether tower, its silhouette a jagged needle piercing the moonless sky. The city groaned, the sound of glass breaking and panicked shouting rising from every quarter. He reached into his satchel and withdrew a spool of conductive copper wire. He needed to bridge the gap between his small press and the city's main grid. His vision blurred, the darkness in his left eye spreading to his right. He walked toward the power junction, his boots leaving dark, wet prints on the pavement. The street was empty, save for the flickering remnants of a street lamp dying in the gloom. He reached the main junction box, its iron casing cold and unyielding. He pried the latch open with a rusted screwdriver, his knuckles white and bleeding. Inside, the machinery sat dormant, stripped of its soul-bound fuel. Eirik pressed his palm against the central coil, feeling the biting chill of the metal. He closed his eyes and forced his focus into the copper, seeking the dormant flow. His skin began to glow with a harsh, flickering blue light. The cost surged through him, a searing agony that felt like needles dragging across his nerves. His veins turned black, the skin of his arms cracking under the strain of the current. He grit his teeth, forcing the electricity to jump from his body into the grid. The street lamp above them flickered, then roared to life with a blinding white glare. Across the district, windows lit up as the power returned in a sudden, violent wave. Eirik collapsed against the junction box, his body racked by violent tremors. He looked down at his hands. They were withered, the skin translucent and gray. He had burned his remaining vitality to light the city, to force the truth into the open. He pulled the last broadsheet from his pocket, the details of the guild's crimes clear and damning. He taped the paper to the junction box, a silent witness to the sacrifice. The sounds of the city changed, the panic shifting into a collective, angry murmur. He heard the heavy boots of the guild's enforcers echoing in the distance. They were coming for the source of the surge, the man who had undone their darkness. Eirik pushed himself away from the wall, his movements slow and agonizing. He turned toward the labyrinthine alleys, his shadow stretching long and distorted on the wet wall. The light he had restored revealed the truth, but it could not save him from the consequences. He was a broken man, a hollow shell of the engineer who had once dreamed of a connected world. He felt the cold, familiar bite of the mountain air as he reached the city outskirts. He looked back one last time at the glowing, illuminated heart of Oakhaven. The people were reading, their voices rising in a tide of realization and fury. He turned away, his boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel of the road. He was alone, the last of his allies gone, his mission finally achieved at the cost of his soul. The wind howled through the valley, carrying the scent of impending storm and change. He kept walking, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first light of dawn struggled to break. The guild's grip had shattered, but the cost had left him adrift in the ruins of his own life. He reached into his pocket and found a single, small gear, the last remnant of his original machine. He tossed it into the tall, swaying grass, a final discard of his past. The road ahead was empty, a long, winding path into the unknown. He did not look back, his steps steady, despite the exhaustion radiating from his bones. The silence of the journey was his only companion now, heavy and absolute. He moved into the gray morning light, a ghost of the revolution he had sparked. The heavy iron door of the junction box groaned as Eirik forced it wider. A swarm of mechanical flies buzzed inside, their brass wings clogged with thick black grease. He reached into the nest of wires, his fingers trembling with the weight of the city's silence. Every circuit in the box was cold, dead, and utterly severed from the main hub. He pulled a spool of copper from his belt and looped it around the central terminal. His skin felt tight, like parchment stretched over dry, brittle bone. He pressed his thumb against the copper, forcing the metal to accept his own internal spark. A spark jumped from his fingertip, blue and jagged, smelling of ozone and singed hair. The connection held for a heartbeat before his knees buckled against the wet cobblestones. He gasped, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. Above him, the street lamp sputtered once, then erupted into a blinding, clinical white glare. The sudden radiance carved harsh, long shadows into the alleyway. Eirik watched as the light cascaded down the street, leaping from lamp to lamp. The houses ahead flickered, their windows blooming with the soft orange glow of returned electricity. A door slammed open down the street, and a man stepped out, blinking against the sudden brightness. The man held one of Eirik's broadsheets, the ink glistening wet under the restored light. The man's mouth opened in a silent shout, his eyes darting to the damning text printed on the page. Eirik leaned his head against the junction box, his breath hitching in ragged, wet intervals. The metal felt like ice against his fevered, sweating brow. He watched the man on the street point toward the guild's distant, looming headquarters. A crowd began to gather, their faces pale and furious in the harsh electric beam. They were no longer cowering in the dark. They were reading the truth. Eirik's vision wavered, the edges of his sight fraying into static and gray fog. He reached out to steady himself, but his hand passed through the air, lacking the strength to grip the casing. The sound of heavy boots echoed from the end of the alley, rhythmic and cold. Enforcers in iron-plated armor turned the corner, their visors gleaming in the artificial light. They carried short swords, the blades etched with the same soul-leeching runes that had killed Kale. Eirik pushed off the box, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He stumbled into the shadows of a narrow side path, his boots scraping against the slick stone. The enforcers stopped at the junction box, their eyes scanning the discarded copper wire. One of them kicked the box, sending a shower of sparks flying into the puddles. Eirik held his breath, pressing his back against a damp, moss-covered brick wall. The pain in his chest flared, a sharp, stabbing sensation that stole his ability to scream. He looked at his own reflection in a puddle. He was a stranger, gaunt and colorless. The enforcers moved past his hiding spot, their armor clinking like chains in a gale. He waited until their voices faded into the general roar of the waking, angry city. He turned toward the city outskirts, his legs feeling like lead weights dragging through deep mud. Every step was a battle against the trembling of his own muscles. The air grew colder as he left the district, the smell of coal smoke replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of frost. He reached the old city gate, its heavy timber doors partially charred from previous riots. He leaned against the wood, his strength failing him entirely. He looked back at Oakhaven one last time, seeing the city bathed in his stolen light. The people were pouring into the streets, a surging tide of humanity driven by the printed words. He had given them the truth, and now the truth would finish what he started. He reached into his pocket and found the iron gear, its edges smooth from years of handling. He placed it on the ground, leaving it for someone else to find in the morning. The wind picked up, swirling snow around his feet like a shroud. He turned his back on the city and began the long, slow walk into the dark. His pace was uneven, a limp that deepened with every agonizing yard. He felt the last of his warmth draining away into the frozen ground. A single star blinked through the clouds, cold and distant, mirroring the emptiness in his chest. He did not look back again, even when the distant shouts of the crowd turned into a rhythmic, unified chant. The revolution had a voice, and it was screaming the names of the men who had kept them in the dark. Eirik's shadow stretched out before him, a long, thin spear pointing into the wilderness. He was a ghost, a myth, a man who had traded his life for a flicker of clarity. The road ahead was a ribbon of gray, disappearing into the vast, indifferent night. He pulled his coat tighter, though the fabric provided no shelter from the biting, absolute cold. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the faint, bruised purple of dawn began to bleed into the sky. He was finally empty, and in that emptiness, he found a strange, quiet peace. The city behind him burned with the fire of his sacrifice, a beacon that would never be extinguished. He walked until the city was nothing more than a memory, a flicker of light beneath the mountains. The world was changing, and he was the architect of a storm he would never see. He collapsed at the base of an ancient, gnarled oak tree, his body finally surrendering to the void. The snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering his tracks as if he had never been there at all. His eyes drifted shut, the image of the glowing, restored city the last thing he held in his mind. The silence of the valley was absolute, a blanket of peace for a man who had known only the hum of wires. The morning sun rose, casting long, golden fingers across the frost. He did not stir as the light touched his face. His journey ended in the quiet heart of the world. The ether tower loomed over Oakhaven like a jagged needle piercing the gray clouds. Its obsidian walls pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic violet glow. Eirik climbed the final spiral staircase, his boots clicking against the cold, frictionless stone. Each breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. His remaining eye burned as he reached the central terminal chamber. Massive copper conduits snaked across the ceiling, dripping with viscous, glowing sludge. Hrolf Grendel stood before the central console, his hands resting on a pulsating, translucent sphere. The overseer did not turn around as Eirik stumbled into the room. The air smelled of ozone and rotting ozone, a scent that tasted like copper on the tongue. Hrolf Grendel gestured toward the humming sphere. The guild did not just transmit messages, he whispered, his voice smooth as polished bone. They fed the hunger of something that slept beneath the foundations of the world. Eirik ignored the warning and lunged for the primary control lever. He jammed his iron gear into the secondary socket, forcing a circuit bypass. Blue sparks erupted, scorching his skin and illuminating the chamber in blinding flashes. The terminal groaned, a metallic shriek that vibrated through the floorboards. He pressed his palm against the terminal's main interface, feeling the raw current tear into his nervous system. His vitality flowed into the machine, a river of golden light pouring into the dark. The guild's protective runes shattered, their black smoke dissipating like burnt hair. He saw the truth reflected in the terminal's flickering glass. The war between Oakhaven and Vylos was a shell game played by a cosmic parasite. Every death, every telegram, and every soul-bound message had been a calorie for the entity. The machine was not a communication tool, it was a feeding tube. Eirik pushed harder, flooding the system with a surge of pure, unrefined electricity. The central sphere cracked, leaking a freezing, shadow-like substance that began to coalesce in the center of the room. Hrolf Grendel fell to his knees, his face twisting in realization as his own power turned to ash. The tower shuddered, the foundations groaning under the weight of an awakening titan. Eirik's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The telegraph key on the desk began to move of its own accord. It clicked with a frantic, metallic urgency. Eirik watched the brass arm strike the plate, etching a message into the air with sparks. The entity was not dying. It was finally arriving. The final transmission flooded the global network, a signal that screamed into every corner of the empire. The message was simple and cold. You have opened the door. Eirik slumped against the terminal, his vision fading into a singular, dark point. The tower light died, leaving the room in a silence heavier than the grave. You thought the story ended when the wires went dark, but the hum is still vibrating in your own walls. You are listening to the same static that called the entity home. The circuit is closed, the door is wide open, and now, you are the final signal.